Brothers and sisters, I love diving into stories of amazing grace. It's an awesome way to learn. I mean, look, we read the Bible, we learn about God. We read the great saints and theologians, we learn about God. Sometimes you look at the biggest messes that God has turned into glory stories and salvific stories, and we could see his face looking at us. His love, his mercy that can't be trumped by any evil. Amazing story tonight with a friend that a lot of you are familiar with, Joseph Pearce. You might be familiar with the 30-plus books he's written, but maybe not familiar with his story of amazing grace. That God changed him from a white supremacist into a lover of Jesus Christ and a lover of his fellow man. That's the story of grace we're diving into tonight, and I'm so excited to have you with us. Thanks for watching. Joseph, thanks for being with me, man.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And you know, I love diving into things like books you've written and talking about Lord of the Rings. By the way, if you didn't see that episode, you got to just Google it. It's on the YouTube page. It's on Formed. But when you get this intimate and you share your own spiritual journey and how God led you from brokenness to wholeness, that takes a level of vulnerability that I just want to say thank you.
Well, my pleasure, if that's the right word. I'm not sure pleasure is the right word. The book, Race with the Devil, I took a long time to write it because I didn't want to be too close to it, to what I was recounting. But on the other hand, I didn't want to wait so long that I'd be too far from it. Yeah. So I think I wrote it about the right time where it was still close enough to hurt, but I was detached enough and far enough from it and far enough, please God, in my spiritual journey to be able to sit back and look at my former self in somewhat of a detached way. Because the two extremes are self-justification and self-loathing, right? I was the worst thing that ever lived. Right, and I wasn't. I was a human person who was doing what I believed was good, even though it wasn't. Yeah. And and I had the dignity of the human person, and God loved what was good in me. And through His grace, I managed to come out of that dark place I led myself to.
Race with the Devil: My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love on Pearce, Pearce.co. Was it painful to write?
Yes, it wasn't it's weird actually, Chris, because on one level it was one of the easiest things I wrote because I didn't have to do any research because it was all up here already. I'd experienced it myself. So it was easy to write from the point of view just getting it down, but the getting it down was painful. So it was both the easiest in terms of technique, but the hardest, most difficult in terms of emotional grappling.
It's like your journal, I mean, in a real way. Have you ever go back and read it?
I haven't gone back to read it, I don't think, no. I mean, it's like wrestling with your former self, but the former self, there's a continuum, right? I mean, I didn't just cease to be. This is a journey. And I sometimes quote Malcolm Muggeridge. Your older viewers might know who Malcolm Muggeridge was, but he was one of the first talking heads on TV. And he was received into the church when he was 78 years old. And this cynical journalist said, "Okay, well now you're too old to have fun. You found Jesus, basically. Do you regret all the fun you had when you were younger?" And amongst other things, he was repeatedly unfaithful to his wife in a string of affairs. So he responded, "I regret all my sins, especially insofar as they've hurt others, but I don't regret the journey because it's brought me to the foot of the cross." So I sometimes think if I'd done what my father wanted, when I was a child and become a bank manager, and lived a good bourgeois life and never became a Catholic, I'd be a respectable member of a secular culture. Or would I rather have gone to prison twice and made all the mistakes I made and be brought broken-hearted but healed to the foot of the cross? I would certainly choose the latter. So I don't regret the path, although I do regret things I did on it, That
is just awesome. Everything can be turned around for the good of those who love and serve the Lord, including your own past mistakes and sins. That's what we were talking about in our other show, in the Silmarillion. When the evil one tries to make his own song, God makes it part of his symphony. He just expands the lines of the symphony, and no, this is part of it now. Keep trying to get away. I'll make this part of it.
Yeah, and I do love it because I think my story does show, as other stories show, no one is beyond his reach. And as many people maybe when you're watching or that they're in a bad place at the moment. No one's beyond his reach, and there are people that are in much worse places than they are that have been brought to the foot of the cross.
Never lose hope.
And they never lose hope.
It's as long as we have breath, and for your kid that's gone astray, for your grandkid that's gone astray, never lose hope. We're going to dive into our conversation, but also be open to being interrupted with texts. 720-650-0100 with questions. 720-650-0100. Let's dive into the story then. You were radicalized, or became radical and a white supremacist as a young man.
Yeah.
What's the road to radicalization from a sweet toddler, to someone who's frankly dangerous and ends up in prison?
Well, one of the toughest things about writing the story was to revisit my relationship with my father, because my father and I had a very good relationship. He was actually, for the most part, a very loving father, and for the most part, a very good man. But he was a racist. So I learned racism at my father's knee, and because I love my father, which is natural enough, you take what your father teaches you as gospel. So I learned that at my father's knee, and by the time I was 14, I was writing, I was daubing swastikas on the wall of my school and on my school books. And by the age of 15, I joined a white supremacist organization called the National Front. By the age of 18, I was the youngest ever member of its governing body. And at the age of 20, I was sentenced to prison for the first time. I started editing a magazine at the age of 16. So, once I got in, I was sucked in big time, became completely fanatical, and would happily have died for the cause, and I would have happily have killed for the cause.
Wow. So your dad imparted this to you. You have to be carefully taught, right? Was it through little side comments? Was it through jokes? Was it through a racist, view that he shared with you, casually, or was he sitting you down and saying, anyone who's not white, British, or whatever it is evil? And did he expose you to the organizations that you joined? How intense was his involvement in that?
Yeah, so he I think he actually sat me down and gave me a lecture. But all of the first things you said, that just the backdrop to our life was racist. Comments that were made, discussions in the house, words that were used. So that was just part of my upbringing. So that was normal for me. Now, my father voted for this organization in 1974 when I was 13. And that was my first introduction to it. But then I joined it and got involved. And he joined it, and he actually came on one or two of the demonstrations, but he was never as fanatical as I was. Largely, I think he came along to one of them, which turned into a really bad riot, thinking he could protect me.
Wow.
And this was bigger than any one person could protect anybody else. This is thousands of people trying to kill each other at the same time.
Wow.
And he realized this is a monster. And I think when I was received, jumping forward a bit, when I was received into the church, both my mother and father were relieved, purely as parents.
So you wouldn't go to jail again?
I wouldn't go to jail again. I wouldn't get myself killed, because I was involved, as apart from the white supremacist stuff, I was involved with the terrorist organizations in Northern Ireland. Wow. So I had two friends who were killed out there. So, I was living a dangerous lifestyle.
Wow.
And I think they thought, that if he found Jesus, then this is going to get him out of that. And thanks be to God, it did, of course.
So the organization really was, the existence of this organization enabled this spark of racism to become something that consumed your life. It gave shape and direction to it.
Ironically, it's how Satan, how the devil can warp and distort good things. So I was a young idealist, right? Mm-hmm. And I had an ideal view of England. And the ideal view of England meant that all Englishmen are obviously white. So if the people living here that aren't white, they're not English. Wow. So you have something which starts off as something that's idealistic, and then it becomes fanatical, and then it becomes hateful. And then it becomes destructive, and it becomes self-destructive and destructive of others. But it starts off, because we're all made in the image of God, starts off with a spark of something which was good, which then the devil distorts and perverts into something which is wicked.
That's something a lot of people forget, and it's good for our own examination of where our lives are going, because we justify things by looking at the goods that we're choosing. And, I think it was Aquinas that taught this really clearly, that you can only choose good things. It's choosing the wrong good thing, or the lesser good thing, and making a god of that lesser good. So it was the good of a national pride,
yes,
profoundly misguided.
Exactly.
What other goods were you choosing? Was there, because when it goes to the next level of violence, was it a desire for power, control, safety, whatever? What were you perceiving that you were going to bring about in England?
See,
true national purity, or what, I'm putting parentheses around all these things. This is, for the record, nothing good here, right?
Right.
But there's motives that are good that the evil one twists into something profoundly evil.
Well, the other thing was, this idealism was a perverse sense of chivalry. So, I was willing, not just willing, I would consider it a great honor, the Dulce et decorum pro patria mori, how sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country.
Wow.
I was willing to die for my country. And so, but of course now I'm dying for a neo-Nazi perversion of what my country is, but I don't see it that way. So, so you start with things that are good, this idealistic desire to lay down my life for others, but then it becomes perverted by this, being motivated by hatred in order to achieve that.
Wow, and this is something we got to, patriotism's a beautiful thing. In the United States too, because the country's become more and more divided.
Right.
And people who are devout Catholics tend to be very aware of how people are skewing left, and to turn a blind eye to when people are reacting against that by going too far to the right in a way that's not grounded in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And they give a free pass to how evil that can get too.
Yeah, and that's what's scary for me with my past, is that that I see people overreacting to nonsense on the so-called. I didn't like you to use the word left and right. I mean that started during the French Revolution, which was a secular fundamentalist turning away from God. Basically, what you have is two types of secular visions that have much more in common with each other than they realize. So the extreme right. I mean, the Nazis were National Socialists. Right, all of their philosophical roots were in 19th century German philosophy. The communists were Marxists and Hegelians. All of their roots were Enlightenment 19th century German philosophy.
Wow.
They're both secular fundamentalists. They might hate each other, but they share a hatred of Christ and His church. So to go to extreme left or extreme right is to turn your back on Christ and His church.
It's like the circle, right? Everyone going right, going left, and then like,
hey,
here we are.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Wow. A lot of people would label Christianity as inherently divisive, and sometimes lump it into this idea that it's part of this colonial power that encourages racism, because they maybe will reduce the entirety of church history to this one aspect of it, right? Your experience was that your atheistic worldview lent itself to your racism that you experienced.
Well, I mean, let's look at the history. Let's look at the history here, right? What have been the most murderous regimes in the history of the world? The French Revolution, atheistic. Communist Revolution, atheistic. National Socialist Nazi Revolution, atheistic. It's atheism that kills people by the tens of millions. And let's keep things absolutely really fundamental here. What at the heart of Christianity is caritas, is love. To love is to put yourself in the paradoxical definition of love. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. To love is to put yourself last and put the other first. That is the cohesion in a loving society, in a civilized world. When you invert that to it's about me, put myself first, right, and everybody else last, and when your pride is basically an enshrinement of selfishness. If you have a society based upon pride and selfishness, it's a society that rips itself apart. And that's what we're seeing now. The absence of Christ is always destructive.
The absence of Christ is always destructive. Man, Jib is the Prince of Peace. Yeah.
Amen.
Wow. Praise the Lord for, again, all these things are taken up into the glory story, right? Sometimes when we fall into evil and you see the full impact of that, it shows the necessity of grace all the more. Sin darkens the intellect. Go back to Aquinas again, right? And people who are part of radical fringe organizations start to form goals that just at face value sound insane. But you actually think they can be accomplished. Did you actually think that you would bring about in England where there was only white people in England? Like, did you really think that would happen?
Absolutely. We stood on a platform at election times of a compulsory repatriation of all non-whites to their lands of ethnic origin. In other words, not just immigrants, but second, third generation. If you were just 1/4 non-white, and then you would be sent back to lands of ethnic origin. Compulsory repatriation. So forcibly removing all non-whites from the country. That was our political platform.
Wow. Okay, someone texted in, how many years were you in prison? And I'd add to that, what was the crime that landed you in prison?
Well, so the last first then. First should be last should be first. I was sentenced to prison both times for the same thing. Britain has a Race Relations Act where it is illegal to publish material likely to incite racial hatred.
Okay.
So I edited a magazine called Bulldog, and it's for editing that magazine that I was charged with offences under the Race Relations Act for publishing material deemed likely to incite racial hatred. I spent 4 months of a 6-month sentence first time, and then I spent 6 months of a 12-month sentence the second time. So I spent my 21st and my 25th birthdays in prison.
Wow. Wow. So it was for spreading these ideas that were, this is something we see in society now, where we take to an extreme the concept of hate speech,
Right.
that disagreeing about anything, and I guess it's partly because how the LGBT movement co-opted what people who experienced actual racial hatred experienced, that this is now, if this becomes your identity, therefore
Right.
saying anything against this
Right.
is deemed a threat to a person, right? Obviously, a balance to be had with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's dangerous, and I feel conflicted up to a point, because there are no laws, at least at the moment in this country, for which I could have been convicted, because there's more freedom of speech, if you want to call it that, over here.
Yeah,
So
people take it to another extreme in response to that and to say, well, you should be allowed to say anything.
Right,
Which obviously you shouldn't.
none of us believe that pornography should be publicly available to everybody. None of us believe that child pornography should be available at all. So clearly there's a line somewhere where we
Right.
say you can't just say and publish what you like. The real question is, where is that line? And it's certainly true in a democracy. You have to have freedom of speech. So you're going to be very careful about what you decide, is hateful. If you're not going to tolerate anybody who doesn't tolerate your own position, right? You're the same as the Nazis. The Nazis would tolerate you if you agreed with them.
Right, right. Okay, so let's talk about the road to conversion. What led you? Because a lot of people, and I love how you said no one's beyond hope. Because if anyone would say someone's beyond hope, they'd look at a white supremacist as one of the first examples I could think of and think that person is so twisted by hatred, so blind, well, just don't even bother. The gospel reached that kid who was blinded by hatred for anyone who wasn't a white, British national. How did God do that? How did he get you?
Well, you would never have got me to read a Christian book. Right? I was anti-Christian, very anti-Catholic. I was raised to be anti-Catholic as well, so Catholics are about beyond the pale. But I was interested in politics and economics, and someone said I should read an essay by G.K. Chesterton on politics and economics.
Wow.
And this was in a book, thick book, and one essay about 2/3 of the way through. And I thought, I bought this book, cost me quite a bit of money. I thought, well, if he's worth reading, I'll start reading from page 1.
Were you in prison at the time?
No, this was actually, I wasn't in prison at the time when I first read Chesterton.
Okay.
But the book's called The Well and the Shallows, and the well is the Catholic Church, has depth, profundity, life-giving water. The shallows is everything else. So I'm reading it, and I'm not agreeing with lots of it, but I couldn't help liking Chesterton. I couldn't help liking enough of the things he said to want to carry on reading. And I loved his sense of humor, and I loved his goodness. And then I was in a second-hand bookshop in London, and I came across this book by an author called C.S. Lewis. And I'd heard of C.S. Lewis as someone who'd written a children's book called The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Yeah. And I had no idea that it was Christian. I had no idea he was Christian. But something, and I have to believe it was the divine grace, prompted me to take the book from the shelf. I opened up at random, and this is when Lewis describes his first reading of Chesterton. And Lewis was an atheist during World War I who detested Christianity. And he says, but I couldn't help liking Chesterton. You'd have thought he was the least conducive of writers. For me, he was a hardened, cynical atheist. But I loved his sense of humor, and I loved his goodness. And I read this saying, this Lewis is brilliant, because he gets Chesterton without being a Christian, right? Yeah. So then I buy this book, which is Surprised by Joy, which is Lewis's own conversion story. And then as I'm reading, I think, he's not going to become a Christian, is it? And then he becomes a Christian. But then I couldn't help liking C.S. Lewis as well. So now I'm reading Chesterton, I'm reading Lewis. Through Chesterton, I discover Hilaire Belloc, these Catholic writers. So then what I described...
They were praying for you, I'll bet you.
I bet they were. And I bet other people were praying for me too, and I thank God for them. So I talk about the fact there's this arm wrestling going on in my heart and my head between these old ideas of hatred and bigotry and these new ideas of love and reason. Because the other thing I was always taught, you have to choose between faith and reason, right? You can't be both, right?
Yeah,
You can have the comforts of religion, but you have to be irrational. Or you can be rational and it just embrace the fact there is no comfort of religion.
Wow.
And then Catholic, when I started seeing the Catholic Church through Chesterton and then Thomas Aquinas and John Henry Newman, would teach about the indissoluble marriage of faith and reason, fides et ratio, as being indissolubly married, and seeing that it made sense that philosophy, these people are philosophers, they're not just emotion driven. It blew me away. And then I was on the journey. So by the time that that second prison sentence, I was reading the right people and had a great desire for faith, and I started to go to mass for the first time during that second prison sentence in prison.
You literally found yourself in a new community, and it wasn't like a prison outreach. It was a heaven outreach.
Yes.
I mean, these are people who had passed already, who were alive in Christ, who probably were talking to the Lord on your behalf. Hey, can we reach out to this guy? We see some great potential.
Yeah, and it is honestly.
And then you just like them. And this is the beauty of saints. People just even if they want to hate Catholicism, it's like, but I like Mother Teresa.
Yeah, I mean that's
don't want to like her.
Ultimately, the best path, rational path to Christ is sanctity, and ultimately, of course, because faith and reason are married, indissolubly wed. No, sanity and sanctity are ultimately the same thing. So if you see someone who's actually living the life of a saint, right, they are leading you not just to love, they're leading you to truth also. And so that, it's easier to say, very hard to do, but if we want to convert the world, we have to become saints.
Mm. Is there a moment as you enter this communion of saints, and we're reading them and realizing, I like these people better than my neo-Nazi white supremacist friends.
Yeah,
I want to be around these people and not these people.
Yeah, who are stabbing each other in the back. All these internationalists, because they're all brutally selfish and ambitious. So all this camaraderie, which you talk about in theory, ends up in practice being people hating each other's guts. I mean, the only people we hated more than the non-whites and the Jews and the communists were each other.
Yeah. Wow.
So, and against that, you've got G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, Thomas Aquinas, John Henry Newman, St. Francis of Assisi, Jesus Christ. Did
you realize did you have one moment where you thought, I have to repent of this life, I have to repent of the racism, I'm going to give my life to the Lord? Was it a scary moment or an elating moment? Because that would require breaking away from everybody you had surrounded yourself with, the reputation you made for yourself as a tough, strong fighter kid who had this cause. What was that moment like?
Well, first of all, one of the reasons I took so long to take the step was because you can imagine both those prison sentences made front page news headlines in the UK. So in the wider world, I was a pariah, this neo-Nazi, hate-filled, bigoted kid. But within the movement, I was a hero, right? A martyr who's gone to prison twice. So where's it much more comfortable to be with people that think you're great and a hero, or to take that step across the threshold to a world where everyone thinks you're mad? So but I did have to make that choice. That second prison sentence, I knew I needed to get out of that whole world I'm living in. So when I got out of prison, I moved to a different part of England where the movement wasn't powerful. And started afresh and started receiving instruction in the church, and was receiving the church when I was 28 years old.
Wow. How did your dad receive the news of your conversion?
My mum and dad were relieved because it's going to keep me out of trouble.
Yeah, that's right.
But I'm really pleased you asked that question, really pleased, because when I give a talk about my conversion, I forget to mention that I feel guilty. My father and I argued about religion, and he was received into the church himself.
Praise God.
Amen. And the last 10 years of his life, he's a practicing Catholic. He was housebound with emphysema. The last time I saw him alive, he received the last sacraments of the church. Last time I saw him alive, about 3 hours before he died, we prayed the rosary together. And when I was growing up, he threw my grandmother's rosary beads. My mother's mum was Irish. Threw my grandmother's rosary beads out the window, saying, "We're not having those papist beads in this house." And he called Catholic bead rattlers. And the last time I saw my father alive, he was rattling his beads.
Hallelujah. Give me a high five there, buddy. That's awesome. Oh, man. Okay, so how was faith the antidote here? How was faith the antidote to being a white supremacist, to racism? To me, it's obvious as a devout Catholic. But there's people watching who aren't into their faith, and they're thinking, so what's the connection?
Yeah, well, the first thing, of course, is that I was convinced that my path to conversion was entirely rational, right? Chesterton, Lewis, Aquinas. And I realized later that the other thing that was happening was healing. but you don't realize when you're sick with that sort of sickness that you're sick. So you're only looking back that you realize it's healing. But the key thing is ultimately that if we will not love each other, and love does mean sacrificing ourselves. It doesn't mean having feelings. Again, so my book is called, subtitle, From Racial Hatred to Rational Love. So the two understandings of love are, one's diabolical and the other is heavenly. The diabolical understanding is love is about a feeling. I love you because you make me feel good. And if I make you feel good at the same time, then that's great. As soon as we don't make each other feel good anymore, then we dump each other, or I dump you and I find someone else who can make me feel good. It's narcissistic, it's selfish, it's putting myself first. A Christian understanding of love is that I will lay down my life for you, and it has nothing to do with feeling. Because, the feeling we have for our spouse, it's not the same as the feeling we have for our children, or our parents, or our neighbors, or our enemies, right? But the feeling has nothing to do with it. We are called to lay down our lives for the beloved, even if the beloved is our enemy. So that's a radically different understanding of love. And that is
rational love.
Rational love, because it's freely choosing. It's a rational choice. I'm not doing this because I feel like doing it. I mean, loving your enemy is probably not something you feel like doing, right? That's not, because it's nothing to do with emotion. It's a rational choice that I am going to lay down my life for you as my Lord laid down his life for me.
Wow.
And that's what radically transforms society. Any other form of love, which is really about me, can just divide and end up being what we see out there now, with lots of mutual hatred, mutual distrust, people blaming each other for everything.
What was the Lord healing you of? Was it just the healing of the wrong perceptions?
Well, no, I think the rational approach was healing me of my wrong healing, if that's the right word. It's disavowing myself of the wrong reason. But things such as racism is not a rational thing, right? It's something which is just like hatred. If you have hatred for somebody, irrespective if it's for a different race, it's another person, then that's not a rational relationship, right? So you can't necessarily reason your way out of hatred. You have to be healed.
Wow.
And for that, you need to ask for help.
So it was a path. It was a path.
Absolutely.
It wasn't an instant. It was, because even the way you describe it, there's this, I'm choosing to love people that I had previously perceived as enemy. And then over time, the choice becomes ingrained in part of you, and they're no longer enemy, right?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there's two things I'd like to say about that, Chris, if I may. First of all, in my book, I talk about 3 different occasions where my enemies loved me when I was a neo-Nazi. Now, my attitude was, it's an eye for an eye. I expect my enemies to hate me. I expect you to try to hit me, and I'm going to hit you back. That's the relationship we have. So on the 3 occasions where instead of hating me, somebody perceived by me as being an enemy, treated my enmity towards them, my antagonism towards them, with a loving response, it's absolutely disarming, and they win. They win the argument just by doing that, right? So that's and I talk about these particular examples. But then about my conversion, Gerard Manley Hopkins in his poem *The Wreck of the Deutschland* talks about a once at a crash Paul, or I think a slow melting Augustine. In other words, there's 2 types of conversion. There's the all of a sudden knocked off your horse of St. Paul, or there is a sort of Augustine of Hippo who takes half his life, to actually convert. So with me, I was more the latter. Really, the whole of the 1980s, the whole of my 20s was this arm wrestle in my heart and mind and soul between these old ideas that were rooted, deeply rooted, and these new ideas that were uprooting them slowly.
Wow. I want to go back to those extremes that we were talking about toward the beginning again, because toward the again, I hate to use left and right, but I'm not sure how else to say this. In response to the reality of racism and racial division and the pain of all of it, we have this veering off in 2 directions. And one is, and you could find a growing amount of examples, it's really disturbing, of neo-Nazi groups in the United States where I would never, like who are these people? It's crazy. And then they're open, and they have a Facebook page. Like, what is going on, right? And on the other extreme, you have a deconstructionism, really, that would look for systemic racism everywhere and label things that aren't even necessarily systemic racism as systemic racism. You were a guy who was actually pushing for systemic racism, right? Those people who deny that can even happen, that there's no such thing as systemic racism. Well, you tried to build a world where it was a reality. Then people who see it everywhere the solution to both these, how to avoid both these extremes. I mean, what would you tell parents and how to keep your kids from veering off into these different directions?
Well, first of all, I would say that an obsession with race is racism. So if your whole worldview is rooted in it's all about race, then irrespective of how your conclusion you draw from that, that's a race obsession. What's necessary is, again, the Christian answer, the dignity of the human person, that we have to treat all of our brothers and sisters, irrespective of what race they are, with the dignity of the human person as made in the image of God. And that was the approach to race relations in this country until these deconstructionists came along with their systemic racism theories. And up to it, I am absolutely convinced a lot of this is using the black population as stormtroopers for radical ideas. In other words, they're just being used.
Yeah, it's a using. It's a using of and white kids too. I mean,
exactly.
Like, it's a using of racial pain.
Yes.
Which is a really gross thing to think of that.
Right.
To push a deconstructionist ideology.
So I should say, so what they're doing, they're fanning the flames of discontent. They're fanning the flames of racial hatred to pursue a radical, relativist, Marxist agenda. That's what they're doing. And the revolutionaries do that. Revolutionaries whip up hatred in order to bring about revolution. Now, whether it's a Nazi revolutionary on one extreme or whether it's a Marxist revolutionary on the other extreme, they whip up hatred to deconstruct society, to destabilize society so that anarchy prevails. And the theory is that out of the anarchy, the movement rises to power. In other words, we can't get elected. We're never going to win a majority. But if we cause a race war, right, then we rise as a phoenix from the ashes. That's the thing. And that works on both extremes, right? You completely destabilize society from Marxist perspective on grounds of race. You can then destroy all notions of civilization, all notions of truth, goodness, beauty. So that's their agenda, but they're using the same technique as the Nazis. Whip up racial hatred to bring about chaos so that our ideas will emerge triumphant.
And everything from the French Revolution to the Nazis to this would have sounded like conspiracy theory 2 years ago, but it's factual now, and you can easily find the information. To the current Marxist moment in the United States and movement, they always appeal to actual injustice to validate what they're doing. And they're always saying, well, this is about equality, this is about liberty, this is about fraternity. It's the French Revolution, right? To where if you speak out against it, they'll say, what, are you against equality and fraternity? And like, no, I'm not. So everyone else is cowed into silence.
Right. They're the only people that represent those ideas now.
Yeah.
And some the extreme Nazis or the extreme Marxists, be my brother or I'll crack your skull.
Wow.
We will only tolerate you if the things which we consider to be tolerable are tolerated by you. And if you don't tolerate those, we will destroy you.
Wow. So what does a parent do when you see your kid getting radicalized, whether it's to the Marxist side of things, and again, this is about staying in the middle place of normalcy, which it seems to be a shrinking island. It's nice to be on this island with you. I always liked islands, right? But then there's the other extreme, obviously, which would deny any pain of racism and just brush this aside and say you can't even have a racism that is baked into a system, and then by the way, be my white brother or I'll crack your skull, right?
Right.
What's a parent watch out for? Is it just the online consumption? How do you just go there when you see an extreme happening? Like, what could your dad have done to save you? Do you just say to your kid, hey, this? A lot of parents feel ill-equipped to call out what's wrong with it. What do they do?
Well, I think the key thing, first of all,
pull the plug out of the internet, right? Sorry.
Well, I'm a techno-minimalist, and certainly we should not encourage our children to spend all of their time online. That is a recipe for disaster. Yeah. So yes, get them reading books. Yes, get them doing things other than being online. Obviously, allow them to be online, but it's going to be rationed. Yeah. And you have to know what it is they're watching and keying into. But no, we have to live our faiths. We have to love our faith. We have to be disciples of Jesus Christ. So that means that we have to love as Christ loves, and we have to be the Logos. We have to be the image of God as reason, as ratio. So we should be able to, first of all, have a loving relationship with our children, even when they are getting poisonous ideas from the zeitgeist, from the culture.
Keep loving them.
Keep loving them, even when they're going off the rails, all right, as the father in the story of the prodigal son did, right? They wander off. He's praying, loving, and when they return, there's a feast, right? But also to have the power of reason. We have to be able to know what we believe and be able to articulate it. Yeah. So we've got to be. I mean, shows like this, right? We've got to be on fire for the faith. We have to know what the faith is, so that we can defend it. We can't defend it unless we have the answers. So we have to make a point of making time in our lives to learn the answers.
Can I ask you to land on this? If someone's a victim of racial hatred, as a guy who was a perpetrator of racial hatred, what would you say to that person?
Well, I would say, first of all, that one evil does not justify another. In other words, if we hate because we've been hated, there are no winners. And it's easier said than done. Now, when we've been victimized, when we've been hurt, and there are various ways we get hurt. I mean, racism is one way, but there's various ways we can get hurt. We can either fester and make that the hatred that comes from the injustice that's been perpetrated to us the catalyst for our own hatred, which is self-destructive and destructive of others, or we have to seek healing. And again, it's easier said than done, but it's impossible without God. So we have to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, and we have to say, look, I've been hurt badly. And people out there, it could be racism, it could be physical abuse, could be other types of abuse, that they're hurting, right? But they need to help for healing, and that can only come from Jesus. It's not going to come from anywhere else. So they have to have a relationship with the Lord, and then that relationship with the Lord will allow them to be healed. And then ultimately, and people that full of hurt, it's very easy, it's hard to understand, to forgive. Yeah. And that doesn't come easy.
No, it's impossible without the Lord.
Exactly.
But it's the only path. Retribution is not the path to healing. Radical forgiveness is the path to healing, and that's not to say that retribution is never called for. But the guiding light of a Christian is the cross. Amen. And it's the path out of the mess that we're in as a society. Yeah. Hey, brother, thank you so much for sharing.
My pleasure.
Thanks for your vulnerability. It takes a lot of courage to share that story, and I'm just so grateful, man.
Thank you. God bless you.
Yeah, thank you. Get Joseph's book, Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love, on Pearce, Pearce.co, not .com, jpearce.co. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He's the answer. He's the golden bullet or the silver bullet. I don't know what literally, you can look for the solutions all over the place. The ultimate solutions are not political. They're spiritual, because the ultimate problem is not political, it's spiritual. Let's keep begging Jesus for healing, for reunification in our society. And if you struggle with that sin of racism yourself, the world would call you a monster. There's no monster. I mean, the Lord's calling you to something else. Ask Him to set you free from that sin. Ask Him to save you, because you can't enter heaven not liking half the people there because they're different color than you. It just doesn't work. So you want a piece of heaven? Ask the Lord to set you free. Thank you, Jesus, for setting us free. Thank you for showing us the path to life and light and joy. I love you guys. Thanks for being with us. Man, wasn't that great? Listen, if you don't want to be happy, be sure not to subscribe. But if you want a more joyful life, the kind of life that God created you for, the kind of life Jesus promised when He said, I came to give you life to the full, then make sure you hit subscribe and share this channel with everybody you know.